So you see the Battle of Leuthen grabbed his attention. He saw some important idea there. Also, later, early on in Lutheran, he could tie it right back to the victories of Frederick and also tied the victories of Napoleon himself. We're trying to get leverage in your adversary. So then, with this in mind, let's break out his art of war in that context. Or we sort of have this notion or key idea had in mind, so we outline his art of war, we can do it. We go to 1836. His key idea was to generalize your like order associative battles of Lutheran play. And then he said in your mind's eye you want to divide the front or the theater up into three parts and subdivision. 2 wings in the center, or he said not so ideally 2 wings, or 2 wings on left and right center. In other words, it's a mental mechanism so you kind of determine how you want to allocate the forces relative to your adversary so you can gain that leverage. And the key idea, gain leverage in terms of what? Those Lutheran-like strategic and grand tactical maneuvers. That's what he's trying to do. And then he recognized the importance of your lines of communication, your bases and your lines of operations, lines of communication. He said you want to set up your bases of operations such that you can shape and shift your operation. In other words, so you can feed these strategic and grand tactical maneuvers so you can gain leverage over your adversary. So he said you can set up your bases accordingly in order to try to do that. But you people know, in a physical sense, he's talking about what? A support base. In politics, you have to have a support base. In anything, you have to have a support base. But he's talking about a physical support base. Okay, so if you pull these things together, then we begin to see strategy and grand tactics. Note this statement: by free and rapid movement, carry bulk of forces against fraction of the adversary. So you see the idea of speed, you see the idea of strength against weakness. Then he said, strike in the most decisive direction, go against the center or one wing or both simultaneously. I have to caveat this because I'm talking about 2 aspects, strategy and grand tactics. If you're operating a large strategic arena, you can go against the center or one wing, but not both simultaneously, because otherwise you may be defeated separately in detail. But if you're up in a grand tactical sense, you're in a smaller region, then you go against one or the other or both, because you have the time and ability to adapt. Okay, and then note this, straight Napoleonic. If possible, grab his communication. Also, he said, without losing your own. The idea is to cut him off, deny him reinforcement, cause him to fight under unfavorable circumstances. Straight Napoleonic. Remember, he was a Napoleonic general. And note this one. If the enemy's forces are too much extended, remember Napoleon's central position, split them up, take out one, then the other. And note this one, just like Patton, hold them by the nose and take them in the rear. Go out flank and turn a wing, hit the enemy in the flank and also contain them at the front. Hold them by the nose and kick them in the rear. Now this last one I want to comment on. Note this, an attack can be made simultaneously on both extremities, but not if you're inferior to your adversary. There's too many counterexamples to that. We already cited a couple of them. Cannae, Marathon, Napoleon in Dresden. He was outnumbered by his adversary and did a double envelopment scheme and succeeded. So that really doesn't hold up. But then, in an absolute sense, but in a relative sense, it does hold up. Unfortunately, he didn't make it clear what he was speaking of. Basically, what he was doing, he was comparing a double envelopment or double outflanking versus single envelopment, single outflanking versus Luftwaffe. And basically, what he really meant to say was, look at, with the same force, I can get more leverage out of a single envelopment scheme than I can with a double envelopment. Or I can afford to lose less force with a single envelopment scheme, and I get the same effect I would out of a double envelopment with a larger force. They're equivalent statements. And we'll see later on the Germans, in many of the Blitzkrieg activities, particularly Manstein and some of the others, were very gifted in terms of interpreting and using that. And then he said to make evident, his aim was to make evident the secret for success more. It wasn't literally a secret. All he's trying to do is give you a way of dealing with this complex activity, what's going on and how you can deal with it so you can cope and adapt. Okay, with that in mind, let's critique Germany. He was very much preoccupied with the form of operations, arrangement of bases, formal orders of battles, etc. That's not so good, because what does that do? You tend to become less adaptable, more predictable. Rigidity begins to creep. Also, he had a lack of appreciation for the use of swarms of guerrillas and skirmishes. In fact, he intended to put them down. Comments on it. And what they tended to do, in other words, to master your own activities and also to confuse the disorder of the enemy. And the likely result, operations become stereotyped unless you can appreciate his ideas outside their formal underpinnings. Now, if you take those formal underpinnings and pull them away, then there's some nice fluidity and adaptability in his operations. But if you tend to retain that, then you tend to be less adaptable, more predictable. In other words, throw away the lattice work. After you create the picture, you don't leave the lattice there in order to screw up the picture. Same thing. And that's it. Well, if you've been following me, you've been tracking what I've been saying about Napoleon, Clausewitz, and now Jomini, you should have detected something. They all, in a sense, had the same blind spot. If you look at all three. All three of them did not appreciate the importance of loose, irregular, tactical arrangements, lower-level arrangements. Loose, irregular. Remember? Clausewitz, worried about method routine. Napoleon, 1791 drill regulations, Clausewitz method routine, and now we see Jomini, some of the same track. Why did they have this blind spot? Because all three of them tended to view the conduct of war from top down, emphasizing adaptability at the top and regularity at the bottom. As a matter of fact, a couple of years ago, an Army colonel got up and said, "Boy, that's all wrong. You don't have it right. That's an incorrect statement. Proceed." He had a beautiful straight man. Nice what he did. He said, "Because today we have regularity at both top and bottom." So I always use that. I said, this is one of the pervasive effects. You know you're all wrong. We have regularity at both top and bottom. Now here's a personal experience. As a matter of fact, you look at our modern command and control systems, they tend to do that. I'll get into that later on. I don't want to preempt myself too much. Because the way we construct our command and control system, that does impose a regularity. We say it isn't there, but it really is. And it causes some problems. Because we tend to articulate it in terms of our high technology. We have all these fusion centers, communication centers. In order to make that work, people tend to do things in very rigid recipes. Go ahead.
Was the regularity at the bottom of their tactics imposed by the general, or was it sort of the chicken and the egg routine that they have rather low quality troops, so on and so forth?
Just a minute. You're preempting me. I'm just going to talk about that. I'm just setting this up. I'm going to talk about it right now. Just hang on, I'll be answering questions. Now recall, we critiqued Napoleon, remember? We said, you know, he got hung up and said he tended to have the tactical regularity. We see the same thing. So the question is, why did this occur? Which is your question. There's a number of things you can offer. One, remember, even though we had the Napoleonic Revolution, which tended to pull these things apart, Napoleon later on reinstalled himself as emperor. Also, remember the period that both he, Clausewitz, and Jomini came out of. They came out of the 18th century, the age of aristocracy, where they want to have adaptability at the top and regularity at the bottom. So in other words, they're imprinted by their culture. We tend to get, you don't even realize, you tend to get imprinted by your culture, then you make decisions based upon that culture. Let me give you an example. This is not going to be a charitable example, sort of. I'm going to hit you over the shoulders with this one a little bit. People like ideology. I call it ideology. It's closer to being idiot. The reason being, if you use ideology as a screening device, then what you're doing, you're denying yourself the opportunity to see things from a different perspective. It's a filtering device. Well, if you've been imprinted by a culture and you see things a certain way, that's another aspect you can think of as sort of an ideology too. So it's a screening device so you don't see things the other way. You've been imprinted. We're all imprinted by our culture. There has some certain value there. If you're not imprinted by a culture, you're going to be confused and disordered all your life. You have to have certain constancies and things in your life so you can deal with variety. But then if you impose those constancies in certain situations such that you can't adapt, then you tend to screen out things you need to know. So even Napoleon himself, who was a creature of the revolution, reinstalled the aristocracy, because remember, his culture is also from the 18th century, which is the aristocracy. You have to keep that in mind. There's some other features, I just wanted to bring that in. Another reason why you could say why Napoleon did, that's one thing, is remember, after he became emperor and he started conquering all his various countries and installing his own puppets or his own people there, as the case may be, he also depended upon these other countries for a troop levy. And so then, in order to get them to work together, he started imposing more and more rigidity. In fact, you can go back to Frederick the Great. He said, hell, he didn't even like to march his army near a wood because he said half of them would desert. They want to keep them in formation. So they're concerned about their troops. So by putting that regularity on was to keep track of them, be sure they showed up for the battle or showed up for their assignment. I want you to keep that in mind. We'll come back to later on in different contexts. So these are the kind of things that are going on. The culture, the fact that these people didn't have a piece of the action. The only way you get them to do something is rather onerous and sharp techniques you use upon them, of uniformity or rigidity. But then when you do that, you also make yourself less adaptable, and also more predictable. There's always, remember, you got to look at these things from different sides. You may get one benefit, but you also may get a detriment somewhere else. You want to keep track of that. You know, you want to have values. You want to have things you believe in, but you want to think about those all the time. You know, by doing this, hey, am I hosing myself over here? Do I have any workarounds? If I don't have any workarounds, I better start rethinking the problem. So you can be committed to something. Remember, if you're going to do something, there may be some disadvantage. Then you can say, well, maybe I can still retain that. I might have some workarounds. Still get me. You want to look for those. Just don't say bullshit. We're going to continue on. How many times have you been in a meeting where you've been in a discussion? This is an important point with people, and maybe a new idea comes out, and the guy says, "Oh, bullshit." He won't even think about it. See, he's got a structure in his mind, and he's got a yes/no system there, and that thing didn't fit that, so he says, "No, it's out, it's out." You know, he's evaluating according to the structure he's got in his mind. It may not even be the right context to evaluate it. You've got to bring it on. You say, "Okay, let that guy talk a little bit. Let's see what that structure is." It might be valuable, and then again, it may be bullshit. I've seen people, we used to call him Dr. No. Guys would say, that's Dr. No. He'll always say no. Doesn't fit. It's imprinted in his brain. Oh, you must. Just, you know, think about it for a while first. Because what you're doing, you're being given the opportunity, maybe or maybe not, to look at something from a different vantage point, which means allow you to widen your variety, which means then you can use it for leverage. And if you're restricted, you narrow your variety, somebody's going to leverage you then. We talked about that at the beginning. Very important. Okay. With that in mind, we find out there are a number of people who talked about war at that time, and some people were affected by the Napoleonic experience. One of these gentlemen was a guy by the name of Schultz. You know Schultz, as I detected here. He was actually in Philadelphia. Note the date. Philadelphia. 1862. What he did, he took all this stuff, he said he reduced the science of war to 3 great maxims. Here they are. Let's read it. His words. During the Civil War. Now, granted, one thing you want to keep in mind here, as we're working our way forward, so far, except when we talked about fighter pilots, we're tending to treat war, except for maybe the way Clausewitz looked at it. Remember, he looked at the psychological and the moral. We tend to think of it very much in a physical sense. Or note this, very much in a physical sense, where he's describing it. That's one thing. The other thing is caution. He really doesn't address it down at these are my words, down at the tactical level. He hasn't come to grips with the tactical level yet. The problems they've had so far. Okay? Okay, with that in mind, let's look at another impact of the 19th century. The so-called rise of modern technology and its impact upon war. We begin to see the emergence of railroad telegraph, foot-fire artillery, machine guns, repeating rifles, barbed wire, and trenches. It's all coming out in the 19th century, latter half of the 19th century. So what do we see in terms of trend? Emphasis toward mass firepower and large armies supported by rail logistics. They had it, so they dump all this firepower in there and use that as a basis for decision. Increased emphasis on holding defense and flanking for wide turning maneuvers. In other words, hold back and sneak in the back door. But still not at the tactical level, the use of these frontal assaults, large stereotype formations, trying to blow their way through. And the result's not too surprising. You tend to suppress ambiguity, deception, mobility. You suppress this, you suppress surprise, what do you get then? Bloodbath. Because these are kind of ingredients you need in order to generate surprise. So let's tie a few of these things together. Let's couple that, the idea of modern technology or the rise of 19th century technology, that with the ideas of Napoleon, Clausewitz, and Germany. Tie that together and you see what happens here then. These things tend to feed upon one another. In other words, I've repeated these words. You tend to suppress ambiguity, deception, and mobility, particularly down at the tactical level. Therefore, you're unable to generate that surprise. And it was done in all these wars. Civil War all the way down through World War I. So in that sense, technology down to tactical is being used as a crude club trying to beat your adversary over the head. Now, if you look, like in the Civil War, people like to criticize Grant very heavily. His Vicksburg maneuver was a very, real neat strategic maneuver. And he, in conjunction with Sherman, laid on a nice strategic maneuver when he was actually he was playing the chain, holding Lee up north, so Sherman could go crashing through the south then. The strategic maneuver, cut the south again in half. But tactically, it was high to the middle, up the middle, and blowing people away, both sides. Didn't make any difference whether it was a long war or a short war. See, so Grant's been criticized, but primarily at the tactical level. But he was no different than other people. They're all doing it. That's my point then. Evolution of tactics did not keep pace with the increased weapons lethality developed and produced by that 19th century technology. So it raised a rather interesting question. Why were the 19th century and early 20th century commanders unable to evolve better tactics to cope with those ingredients that technology produced? In other words, that lethality of those weapons. They didn't. We're going to pretend right now we're still back in the 19th century. We can't answer that question. We're going to answer it. We're back in the 19th century. We don't know the answer either right now. I want to show you some more events where people did cope with it and how they did. Just find the answer, but it didn't get answered until the latter part of World War I. And we'll bring that out. Right now I'm going to let the question stand. We will address it. But I want to bring that to your attention. Okay, with that in mind, there's another thing that showed up in the 19th century. After this, we'll take our break. So we not only have 19th century technology, but 19th century technology also brought about something we call like Marxism. In other words, the impact of 19th century capitalism on, today we call insurrection and revolution. And this is with a Marxian flavor. Remember, I just put on a Marxian hat. I'm a dirty son of a bitch. I'm on the other side. You got to look at the other guy's culture from his viewpoint. That's why I call it with a Marxian flavor. We're going to look at it from their viewpoint and see what we can pull out. I'll let you read it and then I'll comment on it. We all became Marxists when we read this. Now notice a couple things. What we begin to see now is not conflict between social systems, but conflict within a social system. You see what he says, modern guerrilla warfare? Of course. See what I'm leading up to. Keep that in mind. Also, we see these things, we start talking about things like crises and vanguard. You see it very often in their literature, the idea of a crisis and vanguard. Yet we see in our depiction of modern guerrilla warfare, they don't even bring that out. I said, read theirs. They're the ones that are doing it to us. See it from their viewpoint. You might get an insight. Note that we're talking about crises and vanguards, so I underline that. So it raises a rather interesting question. How should such an unpleasant situation be corrected? We'll look at it once again. We'll keep our Marxian hat on. Looking at it from their viewpoint. And after you read this, I'll comment on both these charts. Note what I depict, necessary conditions for success, both the crises and vanguard. You get the crisis, that allows you to build up the vanguard. The vanguard then can exacerbate the crisis builds up even more vanguard, now you got an incestuous feedback loop, you pull the whole thing apart. So look at that. Crises then represent the height of confusion, disorder, and the idea of generating many non-cooperative centers of gravity in a guy's system. In other words, pumping up his internal friction, the inverse Clausewitzian notion. So they are periods of vulnerable weakness. Then the vanguard can exploit that, cause more instability, more crises, which feeds the vanguard, so now you got the thing going where the whole thing comes unglued, you got it all. Oversimplified form. And it's really interesting when you read the Russian documents or you read the Marxian flavor in a modern sense, how they bring out the ideas of vanguards, and crises, and all. They're talking about guerrilla warfare and all this stuff. Very important. So I'm trying to say, in a sense, they are the golden key for Mifflin to penetrate into the idea of insurrection, revolution, guerrilla warfare, insurgency, etc. But think about it. When you're really talking about crises here, you're trying to disrupt or destroy those ties that make a society, generate those non-cooperative centers of gravity, and pump up that internal friction so they can't function as an organic whole. This is that inverse Clausewitzian notion. Okay? Now let's glue it all together up to this point. So what we have here then, we look at capitalism, technology, and the conduct of war. Sort of a quick summary. So we're going to start taking a society apart from within. Now, how can we use these notions? In order to do that, we're going to have to look at World War I, World War II, and their aftermath. We'll do that after. We'll come back after lunch. Before we got into the absolute part of the presentation already, any questions you might have had this morning, or are you still trying to muddle it over in your mind? Let's go on. As I already indicated earlier this morning, there is a hard copy. They want them off. Now, if you recall, I said we wanted to next is look at World War I and, of course, the aftermath of our preceding charter. That's what we're going to do. You can lay it out actually in terms of three parts, what they call the plans and execution phase. You can organize it in this fashion. It's not unusual. And here I'm referring to the Schlieffen Plan and the French Plan 17. Okay, they were implemented, or the beginning of their implementation was in August 1914 era. They pretty much washed out by that October. And in its place came the so-called trench warfare, the stagnation phase. And then, for lack of a better word, the spring of 1918 and beyond, the finale of the final phase. So it's not an unusual breakout, so we'll look through it, through this breakout, this organization. We'll treat them in order, plans and execution, stagnation, and finale. So let's do that. Now, if we look at the Schlieffen Plan, it's a good vehicle for observing that first part. Why, what I'm showing you here is a schematic of the way it actually unfolds, not necessarily the way it was designed. Some of you people have read some military history and there's pros and cons, or we should have gone this way and that way. I don't want to get into that argument. But basically what we have here, we see 5 armies moving on next year. And the idea was to get in behind the Allied armies, put them in a bag, isolate them, and of course, terminate the war. Naturally, that didn't work out. The chart also indicates. So, what am I really trying to depict here? Basically, what I'm showing you is a large-scale single envelopment scheme. It's always a large-scale or a gigantic single envelopment scheme. And we talked about Lutheran light. Now we're seeing a very vast, much vaster scale than we've seen it before. So that's all I want you to remember. Single envelopment, kind of a scheme there. You see that coming about. Also, obviously, you see in here, I normally don't bring it out, but it brings in the nature of unequal distribution of your forces in order to gain leverage. As a matter of fact, that's one of the criticisms why the plan failed. There was sufficient unequal distribution of forces in order to make it work. In other words, initially they did, but then they started modifying the plan. Now, with that in mind, let's look a little deeper. The action and reaction unfolded. What we see, these offenses, like that one, for example, were conducted on wide frontages. But however, they tended to emphasize few rather than many harmonious independent thrusts. In other words, these thrusts, like Amy showed in his previous chart, they all had to work in a lockstep with one another, work together. In other words, they tend to work together. Now, why did people tend to do that? Why did commanders want to do that? Because they were very much concerned about protecting their flanks. In other words, they didn't want to get a flank shot in, so they wanted the units all working at the same pace, or the same rate of move. But if you think about that, if everybody's going to operate at the same pace, then if anybody gets held up, that means all of them are held up. Not only that, or if one operates at a slower pace, you're going to move the pace of the slowest unit. Isn't that a notion of predictability? Obviously. You become more predictable. And also gives your adversary longer time in order to sort himself out. The other point is, if everybody's operating with the same character, you also become more predictable. Everybody's operating at the same pace. All your operations are going to appear alike. All the other ones. So you're not only slower, but you're more predictable. More evident, more obvious. So if you see one aspect, pretty soon you can extrapolate and understand the rest of the aspect. So what happens when somebody gets in trouble, or a unit gets in trouble since they want to free them up, they start feeding reserves. If the other guy starts feeding reserves, you get both sides feeding reserves, now you got a bloodbath. Somebody gets hung up, okay, pump in the reserve. The other guy didn't want, he pumps his reserve in, so now you get this huge bloodbath taking place. I mean, it's strength smashing into strength. Basically what happens. Very simple. And the reaction to this, your defense is organized into what we call belts of fortified terrain, trench warfare. The key ingredients, artillery and machine guns. So if somebody comes on, you lay on the artillery fire. If they come in deeper, you pour in a machine gun fire. So after many casualties are pinned down, then you throw in a counterattack and throw them out. It's done over and over again. Over and over again. And the result, not too surprising. Not too surprising. Example, Battle of Somme, 1916. Very small sector of the front. The British had a 1 week